The sun beat down on Jebediah's back, each drop of sweat a bitter reminder of the water that wasn't. His cattle, once a proud herd, now coughed dust and swayed, their ribs showing like washboards. He watched them, his face a map of wrinkles etched by wind and worry, and the silence of the plains felt heavier than any storm. 3 years. 3 years since the last real rain. He spat into the cracked earth, the gesture as dry as the landscape. Jebediah was a man of few words and fewer hopes these days. The ranch, his father's legacy, was slipping through his fingers like sand. He'd sunk every penny he had into drilling deeper wells, but the aquifer had run dry. Then came Silas, a traveling merchant with a wagon full of trinkets and a glint in his eye that Jebediah didn't trust. Silas offered whiskey, then talk. Talk of mail-order brides, of women from back east looking for a fresh start. Talk of dowries, hefty ones, enough to keep a ranch afloat. Jebediah scoffed. Women weren't commodities. He'd courted his Mary fair and square before the fever took her. But Mary was gone, and the land was dying. Silas persisted, painting pictures of strong, capable women, used to hard work and willing to trade comfort for a stake in the West. He produced a worn book, filled with photographs faded with time. Jebediah flipped through it, his heart a knot in his chest. He imagined a woman with strong hands, capable of mending fences and tending to the sick cattle. A woman who wouldn't complain when the wind howled and the dust swirled. He chose a picture, a woman named Alara, her gaze direct, her expression unreadable. She wasn't beautiful, not in the way Mary had been, but she looked, reliable. Silas quoted a price. Jebediah swallowed hard. It was every last dollar he had, the money he'd been saving for winter feed, for a new well. He hesitated. This felt wrong, deeply wrong. But the cattle were dying, the land was cracking. He handed Silas the money, his hand trembling. He sent off the letter, a short, blunt message stating his needs, his location, and his expectations. He added a single line about a roof over her head and food on the table. Now, weeks later, he stood on the porch of his weathered ranch house, squinting at the horizon. He clutched a worn photograph of Mary in his pocket. The land was harsh, unforgiving, and a hardness, born of desperation, had settled in Jebediah's heart. He wondered what kind of woman would answer such a desperate plea, and what kind of man he had become to make it. The stagecoach was late. He hoped she'd changed her mind. He hoped she hadn't. He didn't know which would be worse. The stagecoach lurched to a halt in front of the Red Creek depot, kicking up a cloud of dust that settled like a shroud over the already parched town. Jebediah watched, his hand instinctively reaching for the brim of his hat, shading his eyes. The driver, a wiry man with a face like sun-baked leather, hopped down and began unloading mail sacks, his movements quick and practiced. Then, he reached inside the coach. Jebediah's breath hitched. He hadn't realized he'd been holding it. He'd imagined Alara 100 different ways during the long, agonizing weeks since he'd sent the letter. He'd pictured a woman with the strength of a prairie wind, lean and weathered, capable of handling the harsh realities of ranch life. Someone who wouldn't balk at hard work. Someone who understood the land's unforgiving nature. What stepped down from the stagecoach was different. Her name was Clementine. He knew that from the tag tied to her worn carpet bag. Clementine was iceage, not in a robust, healthy way, but with a weariness that seemed to weigh her down more than her considerable frame. Her face, though kind, was etched with lines of hardship, deeper than the wrinkles of age. Her dress, a faded calico, strained at the seams. She looked like a woman who'd seen too much, carried too much, for far too long. Jebediah's heart sank. Disappointment, sharp and immediate, pierced through the thin veneer of hope he'd been clinging to. This wasn't the answer to his prayers. This wasn't the woman who would save his ranch. He forced himself forward, extending a hand. "Clementine?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse and disappointment. She looked at him, her eyes a surprising shade of blue in her tired face. "Jebediah," she replied, her voice surprisingly soft. He nodded, his hand still outstretched. He helped her down, the weight of her hand surprisingly heavy in his. As she stepped onto the dusty ground, he couldn't help but notice the scuffed condition of her boots, the way she favored her left leg. A flicker of something akin to pity stirred within him, quickly suppressed. Pity wouldn't save his ranch. Red Creek offered little solace. The depot was a ramshackle building, its paint peeling and windows cracked. A lone dog, ribs showing, scavenged for scraps in the dusty street. The general store looked like it hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint in decades. It was a town clinging to life, much like his ranch. He picked up her carpetbagay, feeling its surprising weight. "This way," he said, turning towards the livery stable where his horse and wagon were waiting. Clementine followed, her gaze sweeping over the desolate landscape. He saw a brief flash of something in her eyes. Resignation, perhaps, or maybe just acceptance. She didn't complain about the heat, the dust, or the lack of amenities. She simply walked, her shoulders slumped, her silence a heavy presence beside him. He wondered what she was thinking, what dreams, or perhaps nightmares, had driven her to answer his desperate plea. He wondered if she knew what she was getting into. He suspected she did. He suspected she had nothing left to lose. The wagon rattled along the rutted track, leading to Jebediah's ranch. Each bump and jolt, a stark reminder of the distance between them. He kept his gaze fixed on the horizon, the endless expanse of parched land reflecting the barrenness within him. Clementine sat beside him, her silence as vast as the plains, her presence a constant, uncomfortable weight. The ranch came into view, a cluster of weathered buildings huddled against the unforgiving landscape. The house, a small square structure, looked even more dilapidated up close. The barn sagged, its roof patched with mismatched planks. The corrals were empty, save for a few listless chickens pecking at the dry earth. Jebediah pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house. He hopped down, offering Clementine a hand, his touch brief and impersonal. "This is it," he said, his voice flat. She looked around, her gaze lingering on the dilapidated buildings, the parched fields, the empty horizon. He saw no surprise in her eyes, no disappointment, only a quiet acceptance. Days bled into weeks, each one a testament to Jebediah's growing resentment. He assigned Clementine simple tasks, feeding the chickens, weeding the small struggling garden Mary had once tended, mending fences. He avoided direct eye contact, his words clipped and functional. He barely acknowledged her presence, treating her more like a hired hand than a partner. He watched her from a distance, his guilt a gnawing presence in his gut. He saw the way she moved, slow and deliberate, her left leg still favoring the injured side. He saw the gentleness with which she tended to the chickens, the way she coaxed life back into the parched earth of the garden. Her touch was surprisingly gentle, a stark contrast to the harshness of the land, and his own heart. The ranch house felt small, its lines thick with unspoken feelings. Jebediah ate his meals in silence, his gaze fixed on his plate. He slept in the bedroom he'd shared with Mary, the memory of her laughter and warmth a constant ache. Clementine slept on a cot in the small, dusty parlor. He knew he was being unfair. He knew he was taking his anger and disappointment out on her. But he couldn't help it. She was a constant reminder of his failure, of his desperation, of the bargain he had made with himself and with Silas. She was not the woman he had hoped for, the woman who would save his ranch. She was simply there. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Jebediah found Clementine in the garden, watering the few struggling plants with a bucket of water she had hauled from the well. He watched her, his face etched with a mixture of guilt and resentment. He cleared his throat. "Water's low," he said, his voice gruff. "Don't waste it." Clementine didn't look up. "I'm careful," she said softly, her voice barely audible above the chirping of the crickets. He hesitated, wanting to say something more, something kinder. But the words caught in his throat. He turned and walked back towards the house, the silence following him like a shadow. The weight of his guilt pressed down on him, heavier than ever. He knew he couldn't continue like this. Something had to change. But he didn't know what or how. He only knew that the hardness in his heart was slowly turning to stone. The garden, a patch of earth no bigger than a grave, surprised him. It wasn't supposed to thrive. Nothing thrived here. Yet under Clementine's care, it did. Tomatoes, plump and red, clung to their vines. Squash, yellow and green, sprawled across the ground. Even a few delicate flowers bloomed, their colors a defiant splash against the monochrome landscape. Jebediah watched her work, his arms crossed, leaning against the rough-hewn weeds. He didn't understand it. He'd tried to coax a garden from this land himself after Mary died. He'd failed, miserably. He'd chalked it up to the drought, to the unforgiving nature of the soil. But Clementine, she seemed to have a way with the earth. She spoke to the plants in soft murmurs, her hands gentle, as she weeded and watered. She mixed strange concoctions of manure and ash, her methods unorthodox, almost mystical. He'd scoffed at first, dismissing it as foolishness. But then the tomatoes ripened, the squash swelled, the flowers bloomed, and he was forced to admit, however grudgingly, that she possessed a skill he lacked. The vegetables were a welcome addition to their meager meals. Before, they had subsisted on beans and salted pork, a monotonous diet that did little to lift their spirits. Now, there were fresh tomatoes in their stew, squash roasted in the embers of the fire. It was a small thing, a simple thing, but it made a difference. Clementine never mentioned it, never boasted about her success. She simply placed the food on the table, her gaze averted, her silence as heavy as ever. But Jebediah saw the faint smile that played on her lips, the quiet satisfaction in her eyes. One evening, he found her in the garden as the sun was setting, her silhouette framed against the fiery sky. She was humming softly, a tuneless melody that somehow resonated with the stillness of the land. He stood there for a moment, unseen, unheard, watching her. He saw the lines of hardship etched on her face, the weariness in her shoulders. But he also saw something else. A resilience, a quiet strength, a deep connection to the earth. He cleared his throat, the sound startling her. She turned, her blue eyes wide. "That garden," he began, his voice rough. "It's good." Clementine simply nodded, her gaze returning to the plants. He hesitated, unsure how to proceed. He wasn't a man of compliments. He wasn't a man of anything, really, these days. The food," he stammered. "It's appreciated." She looked at him then, her eyes meeting his. There was no accusation in her gaze, no judgment, only a quiet understanding. "You're welcome, Jebediah," she said softly. He turned and walked back towards the house, the weight on his heart a little lighter than it had been before. He still didn't understand Clementine. He still didn't know what to make of her. But he knew one thing. She was more than just a mail-order bride. She was something else entirely. Something unexpected. Something, perhaps even, valuable. The thought surprised him. A seed of hope planted in the barren landscape of his soul. He still had a long way to go. But maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for redemption. Maybe there was a chance for something more than just survival. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for life. The morning dawned harsh and unforgiving, painting the plains in a sickly yellow light. Jebediah found the calf, lying listlessly in the dust of the corral, its breathing ragged and shallow. He knelt beside it, his brow furrowed, his large hands running over its thin frame. The animal was a prize, a Hereford bull calf, one of the few decent offspring from his dwindling herd. Losing it would be another blow, another nail in the coffin of his failing ranch. He'd tried everything he knew. He'd checked for bloat, examined its gums, even forced a little water down its throat. Nothing seemed to help. The calf just lay there, its eyes dull with fever, its body trembling weakly. Frustration boiled inside him. He was a rancher, damn it. He knew cattle. He knew the land. But this was beyond him. He felt helpless, a feeling he hadn't experienced since Mary. He stood kicking at the dust, his gaze sweeping the empty horizon. He needed help. He needed a vet, but the closest one was days away, and he couldn't afford it anyway. He was trapped, caught in a spiral of misfortune, with no escape in sight. Clementine appeared beside him, her presence as quiet and unassuming as ever. She knelt beside the calf, her touch gentle as she stroked its head. "He's bad, isn't he?" she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. Jebediah grunted in response, unable to meet her gaze. He didn't want her pity. He didn't want her to see his failure. "I might have something that can help," she said, her voice hesitant. He finally looked at her, his expression skeptical. "Help? What do you know about cattle?" She didn't flinch at his harsh tone. "My mother, she knew a lot about healing, herbs, roots, things like that. She used to doctor animals back home." Jebediah snorted. "Home? What home? Some backwater town you ran away from?" He regretted the words as soon as they left his mouth. He saw the hurt flicker in her eyes, but she didn't respond. She simply stood and walked towards the house. He watched her go, his guilt a familiar ache in his gut. He was a cruel man. He knew that. But he couldn't seem to help himself. He was lashing out, trying to protect himself from the pain, the disappointment, the crushing weight of his failures. A few minutes later, Clementine returned, carrying a small earthenware pot. The air around her smelled faintly of herbs and spices, a strange and unfamiliar scent in the harsh, dusty landscape. "What is that?" Jebediah asked, his voice still gruff. "A tonic," she said, "for his fever. It might help him sweat it out." He watched her with a mixture of skepticism and grudging curiosity as she carefully poured some of the liquid into a small cup. She knelt beside the calf again, gently coaxing it to drink. The calf resisted at first, but Clementine persisted, her voice soft and soothing. Finally, the calf swallowed a few mouthfuls. Clementine continued to feed it, slowly and patiently, until the cup was empty. She stood wiping her hands on her apron. "We'll have to wait and see," she said. "It might take a while for it to work." Jebediah didn't say anything. He simply watched the calf, his expression unreadable. He didn't believe it would work. He'd seen too much death, too much loss, to believe in miracles. But he stayed there, beside the calf. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, he watched as Clementine tended to the animal, her movements gentle and unwavering. He watched as the calf's breathing slowly became less labored, its body less tense. By late afternoon, the calf was resting more comfortably. Its fever seemed to have broken, and it was even attempting to stand. Jebediah couldn't believe his eyes. He'd expected the calf to die. He'd resigned himself to another failure. But Clementine, she had done something. She had seated. He looked at her, his gaze softening for the first time. How did you do that?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. Clementine shrugged, her gaze averted. "My mother taught me," she said. "She knew the secrets of the land." He hesitated, unsure how to express his gratitude. He wasn't a man of words. He wasn't a man of anything. The tonic. It worked. He managed finally. A gruff admission, but sincere. Clementine only nodded, gathering the empty pump. The sunset painted the sky in bruised hues of purple and orange, mirroring the turbulent emotions churning within him. As twilight deepened, they retreated to the small house. The usual silence descended, heavier now, charged with unspoken gratitude and a nascent respect. Later, after a supper of beans and the last of the roasted squash, Jebediah sat by the dying embers of the fire, whittling a piece of wood. Clementine sat across from him, mending a tear in one of his shirts. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the rhythmic scrape of his knife. He glanced at her, the firelight dancing in her blue eyes. He saw a weariness there, but also a quiet strength, a resilience that mirrored the tenacious wildflowers clinging to life on the harsh plains. "Your mother," he said, his voice low. "She must have been a strong woman." Clementine paused in her mending, her gaze fixed on the fire. "She was," she said softly. "She had to be." "Life wasn't easy where we came from." He waited, sensing that she wanted to say more. After a long silence, she spoke again, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. "We lived in a small town in the mountains. My father, he was a miner. He died when I was young, a cave-in. My mother, she did what she could to keep us Indians. She took in washing, grew vegetables, doctored animals. She knew everything about the land, about the plants and the herbs. She taught me everything she knew." She paused, her gaze distant. "It was a hard life, but it was good. We had each other. We had the mountains. We had hope." Jebediah listened, his knife still, his gaze fixed on her face. He'd never heard her talk so much before. He'd never seen her so owen. "What happened?" he asked gently, his voice barely a whisper. Clementine sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. The mine closed. The town dried up. People started leaving. My mother, she got sick. There was nothing I could do. She died last winter. Her voice broke, and she turned away, her hand trembling slightly. Jebediah hesitated, unsure what to do. He wasn't a man of comfort. He wasn't used to seeing women cry. But he couldn't just sit there and do nothing. He stood and walked over to her, kneeling beside her. He reached out and gently took her hand in his. Her hand was small and calloused, but her grip was surprisingly strong. I'm sorry, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I'm sorry for your loss. I'm sorry for everything. She looked at him then, her eyes filled with tears. Thank you, Jebediah, she said softly. That means a lot. They sat there in silence for a long time, her hand in his, the fire crackling between them. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know if he could ever truly make her happy. But he knew one thing. He wanted to try. He wanted to be a better man. He wanted to be worthy of her quiet strength, her unwavering spirit. He wanted to give her a reason to hope again. As the fire died down to embers, Clementine spoke again, her voice stronger now. My mother used to tell me stories, she said. Stories of the mountains, of the animals, of the people who lived there. Stories of hope and resilience. Stories that kept us going, even when things were at their darkest. She smiled, a faint, flickering smile that lit up her face. Maybe I'll tell you some of those stories sometime. Jebediah squeezed her hand gently. I'd like that, he said. I'd like that very much. The ice around his heart had begun to crack. The morning sun, usually a harsh glare, felt like a physical blow against Jebediah's skull. He hadn't slept well, haunted by the memory of Clementine's story and the quiet hope he'd glimpsed in her eyes. He'd dared to imagine a future, a life beyond mere survival, and the thoughts terrified him. He was a broken man, mired in debt and despair. He had nothing to offer her. He found her in the garden, already tending to her plants. Tomatoes were ripening, their red skins gleaming in the sunlight. The squash vines sprawled across the ground, heavy with fruit. A fragile beauty blooming in the face of adversity. He watched her for a moment, his heart aching with a mixture of gratitude and guilt. He hadn't deserved her kindness. He hadn't deserved her strength. He hadn't deserved this fragile peace they'd found. A dust cloud on the horizon shattered the illusion. A single rider, approaching fast. Jebediah recognized the horse, a mean-looking Appaloosa with a distinctive blaze. His gut clenched. He turned to Clementine, his face grim. Trouble's coming, he said, his voice low. Go and see Thai. Clementine straightened, her gaze fixed on the approaching rider. She didn't flinch, didn't show any fear. Who is it? She asked, her voice calm. Name's Cutter, Jebediah said, his jaw tight. He collects debts. And I owe him. Clementine's eyes widened slightly. But she didn't say anything. She simply nodded, her hand instinctively reaching for the small knife she used for gardening. Cutter reined in his horse in front of the house, the dust swirling around him like a malevolent spirit. He was a lean, wiry man, with a face etched with cruelty. His eyes, cold and calculating, scanned the property, taking into every detail. Jebediah, he said, his voice raspy, like gravel grinding against gall. I've come for what's owed. Jebediah stepped forward, His shoulders slumped, his gaze averted. I don't have it, Cutter, he said, his voice barely audible. The drought, the cattle. I'm broke. Cutter chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. That's not my problem, Jebediah. You signed the papers. You made the promise. Now it's time to pay up. He dismounted, his spurs jingling as he walked towards Jebediah. I'm a reasonable man, he said, his voice deceptively calm. I'm willing to work with you. You can pay me in cash or you can pay me in kind. His gaze flickered towards Clementine, who stood silently by the garden fence, her knife glinting in the sunlight. Jebediah's blood ran cold. He knew what Cutter was suggesting. He'd heard stories of what Cutter did to women who couldn't pay their debts. No, Jebediah said, his voice raising, his fists clenching. You stay away from her. She's got nothing to do with this. Cutter smiled, a slow, predatory smile that sent a shiver down Jebediah's spine. Everything has something to do with this, Jebediah, he said. Everything is collateral. You should have thought about that before you borrowed my money. He stepped closer, his hand reaching for the gun at his hip. Now, are you going to pay me or are we going to do this the hard way? The air crackled with tension. Jebediah stood his ground, his eyes locked on Cutter's. He knew he was outmatched. He knew he couldn't win. But he wouldn't back down. He wouldn't let Cutter touch her. Clementine watched, her face pale but resolute. She knew what was at stake. She knew that Jebediah was willing to sacrifice everything for her. And in that moment, she made a decision. She wouldn't be collateral. She would be the one to decide her fate, and perhaps Jebediah's as well. The garden knife felt small in her hand, but the determination burning in her eyes was anything but. Cutter's smile widened, seeing Jebediah's hesitation. That's what I thought. Seems you're a reasonable man after all. He took another step, reaching out, not for his gun, but towards Clementine. Before Cutter could touch her, Clementine stepped forward, her voice clear and steady. Wait. Both men turned towards her, surprised. Jebediah's eyes pleaded with her to stay silent, to stay silent. I have something to offer, she said, her gaze fixed on Cutter. Something of value. Cutter raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Oh, and what might that be, little lady? Clementine didn't answer. Instead, she turned and walked towards the house, her movements purposeful. Jebediah watched her, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea what she was planning. She returned a few moments later, dragging a heavy wooden trunk. It was old, its surface scarred and worn, but the brass hinges gleamed in the sunlight. She heaved it to the ground with a grunt, the sound echoing in the tense silence. What's this? Cutter asked, his eyes narrowed. Clementine knelt beside the trunk, her fingers tracing the outline of a faded flower, carved into the wood. My family heirlooms, she said, her voice low. Quilts. Hand-stitched intricate designs. Worth a great deal. She opened the trunk, revealing a stack of quilts, each one a masterpiece of color and texture. Intricate patterns of stars, flowers, and geometric designs were meticulously sewn together, a testament to generations of skilled craftsmanship. The air filled with the scent of lavender and old cotton. Jebediah stared at the quilts, his mouth agape. He had no idea Clementine possessed such treasures. He'd seen her mending his clothes with simple patches, never suspecting she was capable of such artistry. My mother and her mother before her. They made these, Clementine said, her voice thick with emotion. They're more than just blankets. They're stories, memories. She looked at Cutter, her eyes pleading. I'll give you all of them. They're worth more than what Jebediah owes you. Take them and leave him alone. Cutter's eyes gleamed with avarice as he surveyed the quilts. He knew their value. He'd seen quilts like these fetch high prices in town. He could sell them easily, make a tidy profit. He hesitated, weighing his options. On the one hand, he could take the quilts and be done with it. On the other hand, he could still have his fun. Jebediah stepped forward, his voice filled with a mixture of anger and desperation. Don't do this, Clementine, he said. They're your family's. You can't just give them away. He turned to Cutter, his fists clenched. Take my land. Take my cattle. Take everything I have, but leave her and her quilts alone. Cutter ignored him, his gaze fixed on Clementine. Are you sure about this, little lady? He asked, his voice deceptively soft. Once they're gone for good. Clementine nodded, her face pale but resolute. I'm sure, she said. Just promise you'll leave him alone. Jebediah watched, his heart breaking, as Clementine bartered away her family's legacy to save him. His pride warred with his gratitude. He wanted to refuse, to fight, to protect her. But he knew he was powerless. He was trapped, caught in a web of debt and despair with no escape in sight. He was a failure as a rancher, and now he was failing her too. The quilts, vibrant testaments to love and perseverance, seemed to mock his inadequacy. Cutter's smile stretched thin, revealing yellowed teeth. All right, little lady. You got yourself a deal. He gestured to two men who had been waiting back by the road, barely visible in the heat shimmer. Help me load these up. The men approached, their eyes darting nervously between Jebediah and Cutter. They lifted the heavy trunk, grunting with the effort, and carried it towards Cutter's wagon. The vibrant colors of the quilts seemed to dim in the harsh light, their stories muted by the transaction. Jebediah watched, numb, as his debt was paid in threads of love and memory. He felt a profound shame, a sense of worthlessness that settled deep in his bones. He'd let her do it. He'd stood by and watched her sacrifice everything. Cutter, satisfied with his haul, mounted his Appaloosa. He looked down at Jebediah, a cruel glint in his eye. Consider this a lesson, Jebediah. Don't borrow what you can't repay, and choose your collateral more carefully next time. He spat on the ground and spurred his horse, the wagon creaking behind him as he rode away, leaving a trail of dust and despair in his wake. Clementine stood beside Jebediah, her face pale but composed. She didn't look at him, didn't say a word. She simply turned and walked back towards the house, her shoulders slumped slightly. Jebediah watched her go, his heart aching. He knew he had to do something. He couldn't let her carry this burden alone. Clementine, he called out, his voice hoarse. She stopped, but didn't turn around. He walked towards her, his steps heavy. He reached out and gently touched her arm. I don't know what to say, he stammered. Thank you, but I shouldn't have let you do that. Clementine finally turned to face him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resolve. It's done, Jebediah, she said softly. Don't worry about it. They were just quilts, but they weren't just quilts. They were her history, her heritage, her connection to her past. And he knew deep down that he had to find a way to get them back. A week later, Jebediah rode into town, his jaw set with determination. He had a plan, a long shot, but it was the only thing he could think of. He found Cutter's wagon parked outside the saloon, the quilts piled high in the back, covered by a tarp. He walked into the saloon, the smell of stale beer and sawdust filling his nostrils. He found Cutter at a poker table, surrounded by a group of men. "Cutter," Jebediah said, his voice loud enough to be heard over the din. Cutter looked up, a sneer on his face. Well, if it isn't Jebediah, come to beg for more time?" "I've come to buy back the quilts," Jebediah said, his voice firm. Cutter laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You don't have enough money to buy a single thread from those quilts, Jebediah. They're spoken for." "They're worth more than you think," Jebediah said. "The women in town, they appreciate fine work." "Let me show them." "Let them bid." Cutter considered this, stroking his chin. He knew Jebediah was right. The women of the town were always looking for quality goods, and these quilts were exceptional. He might make even more money if he auctioned them off. "All right," Cutter said, a glint in his eye. "I'll give you one chance. Set up an auction. If you can raise enough money to match my price, you can have them back. But if you fail, you owe me double." Jebediah swallowed hard, knowing the risk. "Deal," he said. The word spread through the town like wildfire. Jebediah, with the help of the local storekeeper, cleared out the town square. The women arrived, their eyes wide with anticipation as the quilts were unveiled. A murmur of appreciation rippled through the crowd. They recognized the quality, the artistry, the history woven into each stitch. The bidding started low, but quickly escalated as the women competed for their favorite quilts. Jebediah watched in amazement as the prices soared, exceeding even Cutter's expectations. He saw the respect in their eyes, not just for the quilts, but for Clementine, whose is. By the end of the auction, Jebediah had amassed a sum that surpassed Cutter's initial valuation. He approached Cutter, his hand outstretched, the money clutched tight. Cutter, his face a mask of barely concealed fury, counted the money twice, then shoved it into his pocket. "They're yours," he spat, turning and stalking away, the crowd parting before him, like the Red Sea. Jebediah returned to the ranch, the quilts piled high in his wagon. As he pulled into the yard, Clementine emerged from the house, her expression unreadable. He climbed down, his heart pounding in his chest. He hadn't spoken much to her since the incident with Cutter. "I got them back," he said, his voice rough with emotion. He gestured to the wagon. "Every last one." Clementine's eyes welled up, and she rushed forward, throwing her arms around him. "Thank you, Jebediah," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. "Thank you." The town, buzzing with newfound prosperity and unity, decided to hold a dance. It was a celebration of resilience, of community, and of the quilts that had, in a strange way, brought them all together. The dance was held in the newly repaired town hall, the air filled with the sounds of fiddles and laughter. Jebediah, scrubbed clean and wearing his best shirt, stood awkwardly near the wall, watching Clementine. She looked radiant, her eyes sparkling in the lamplight. He knew he had to do something, had to finally voice the apologies that had been swirling inside him for so long. He approached her, his heart pounding in his chest. "Clementine," he said, his voice barely a whisper. She turned to him, her expression wary. I wanted to apologize," he stammered, his gaze fixed on the floor. For the way I treated you when you first arrived. I was wrong. You're a strong, good woman, and I'm grateful for everything you've done for me, for this place. He paused, gathering his courage. And for the quilts. He looked up, meeting her gaze, and I was wondering if you'd do me the honor of a dance. Clementine's eyes softened, and a small smile played on her lips. I would like that very much, Jebediah, she said, her voice soft. He led her onto the dance floor, the fiddles swelling around them. As they moved together, awkwardly at first, then with growing confidence, Jebediah felt a sense of lightness he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just gratitude, or even respect. It was something more, something fragile and new, beginning to bloom in the barren landscape of his heart. The dance was more than just a gesture. It was a promise, a tentative step toward a future he hadn't dared to imagine. The West remained wild, unforgiving. But tonight, under the soft glow of the lamplight, a small act of mercy had taken root, offering a glimmer of hope in the dust and shadows. The dance ended, but the warmth lingered. Jebediah walked Clementine back to the house, the moon casting long shadows across the yard. He felt different, lighter. The dance had loosened something inside him, a knot of regret and self-doubt that had been tightening for years. He lingered at the door, unsure how to say goodnight. Clementine, sensing his hesitation, turned to him. Thank you, Jebediah, she said softly, for everything. And for the dance. He nodded, unable to find the right words. He wanted to tell her how beautiful she looked, how much he appreciated her strength, but the words caught in his throat. He was a man of the land, not of eloquent speeches. There's something I need to show you, Clementine said, her voice suddenly serious. She reached inside her worn satchel and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. What is it? Jebediah asked, a flicker of unease creeping into his chest. The letter, she replied, her gaze steady. The one, you sent to the mercantile. Jebediah frowned, confused. He remembered the letter, the desperate plea he'd penned in a moment of weakness. He'd asked for a wife, someone to share the burden of the ranch. Clementine unfolded the letter, holding it out for him to see. He squinted in the dim light, reading the familiar words. But as he scanned the page, he noticed something was different. A word carefully altered, a phrase subtly twisted. He pointed to a line, his voice rising in disbelief. This isn't what I wrote. Clementine nodded. I know. I found the original tucked away in the mercantile's ledger after the auction. The merchant, Silas, admitted to altering your request. He claimed it would fetch him a higher price. Jebediah stared at the altered words, his mind reeling. He had written, asking for a soulmate that could hold the farm together. But Silas had changed it, subtly but significantly, to a slim wife to help him. The implications crashed down on him like a thunderclap. He had been operating under a false premise, a lie manufactured for profit. He had judged Clementine, formed his initial impressions based on Silas's deceitful manipulation. He looked at Clementine, his face etched with shame. I can't believe it, he stammered. I misjudged you. I misjudged everything. The anger he had harbored towards Clementine was behind, the resentment he had felt for her, perceived lack of experience, evaporated in an instant, replaced by a profound sense of guilt and self-reproach. He had been so blinded by his own preconceived notions, so desperate for a solution to his problems, that he had failed to see the truth. Clementine reached out, placing her hand on his arm. "It's all right, Jebediah," she said softly. "It's in the past. What matters is what we do now." But it wasn't all right. It was a revelation that cut deep, forcing him to confront his own flaws, his own biases. He had been so quick to judge, so slow to trust. He had allowed Silas's greed to cloud his judgment, to warp his perception of Clementine, and more importantly, of himself. He looked at her, truly saw her, for the first time. Not as a mail-order bride, not as a solution to his problems, but as a woman of strength, resilience, and unwavering loyalty. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he had been given a second chance, a chance to right his wrongs, to earn her trust, and to build a future together, not based on lies and deception, but on honesty and respect. The night air was still, the only sound the distant howl of a coyote. Jebediah looked out across the moonlit fields, the weight of his past mistakes heavy on his shoulders. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, he also felt a flicker of hope. A hope that, with hard work, honesty, and a little bit of luck, he could finally become the man Clementine deserved. The next morning, Jebediah saddled his horse, his jaw set with a grim determination. He had a reckoning to make. He found Clementine tending the chickens, her face etched with concern. He hadn't slept, the revelations of the previous night churning in his gut. "I'm going into town," he said, his voice rough. "I have to settle things with Silas." Clementine nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. "Be careful, Jebediah." He offered her a weak smile, then spurred his horse, the animal responding with a burst of energy. The ride into town was a blur, the landscape a mere backdrop to the storm raging inside him. He arrived at the mercantile, the bell above the door jingling as he pushed it open. Silas, a portly man with a greasy smile, was behind the counter, sorting through a pile of invoices. Well, Jebediah," Silas said, his voice dripping with false cordiality. "What brings you in today? Need more supplies?" Jebediah ignored the pleasantries. "I know what you did, Silas," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I know you altered my letter." Silas's smile faltered, his eyes darting nervously around the store. "I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered. "Don't lie to me," Jebediah said, stepping closer, his presence filling the small space. "Clementine found the original letter in your ledger. You changed my words, twisted my intentions, all for a few extra dollars." Silas's face flushed red. "It was just business, Jebediah," he said, his voice rising defensively. "I didn't mean any harm." "Harm?" Jebediah scoffed. "You manipulated my life, Silas. You manipulated hers. You built your business on lies and deceit." He slammed his fist on the counter, the force of the blow rattling the shelves. "I want justice, Silas. I want you to admit what you did." Silas, seeing the fury in Jebediah's eyes, finally relented. He slumped against the counter, his face pale. All right, he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I did it. I changed the letter. I thought it would be better for business." "Better for business?" Jebediah repeated, his voice laced with contempt. "At the expense of other people's lives? That's not business, Silas. That's greed." He paused, taking a deep breath, trying to control his anger. "I want you to write a letter of apology, Silas. To Clementine. and I want you to post it publicly where everyone in town can see it." Silas hesitated, his face contorted with resentment. "I'm not doing that," he said stubbornly. Jebediah leaned in, his eyes locking with Silas. "Then I'll tell everyone in town what you did," he said, his voice cold and unwavering. "I'll tell them how you cheated me, how you manipulated Clementine, and I'll let them decide what to do with you." Silas knew he was beaten. He had underestimated Jebediah's resolve, his newfound sense of purpose. He also knew that the townspeople, once they learned the truth, would not be kind. He sighed, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "All right," he said, his voice barely audible. "I'll do it. I'll write the letter." Jebediah watched as Silas, his hands trembling, penned the apology. It was a clumsy, begrudging admission of guilt, but it was a start. He took the letter, folded it carefully, and pinned it to the mercantile's front door. As he walked away, he felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. He had confronted his past, faced his demons, and reclaimed his dignity. The road ahead would still be long and arduous, but he knew, with Clementine by his side, he could face anything. The dust devils danced in the street, the sun beat down with relentless intensity, but in Jebediah's heart, a new seed had been planted. A seed of hope, of redemption, and of the enduring power of truth. The dust hadn't settled from the Silas affair, when the ski turned the color of bruised plums. The wind, which had been a gentle whisper, became a howling beast clawing at the ranch house. Jebediah, surveying the horizon, felt a familiar dread creep into his gut. This wasn't just a storm. This was a reckoning. He found Clementine securing the chicken coop, her face pale but resolute. "We need to get the animals inside," he yelled over the rising wind, "and reinforce the barn." They worked side by side, their movements a well-worn dance. Jebediah wrestled with the barn doors, securing them with heavy chains, while Clementine herded the livestock, her voice surprisingly calm amidst the chaos. The first fat raindrops began to fall, splattering against the parched earth, quickly turning the dust into mud. The storm hit with a ferocity that stole their breath. The wind shrieked like a banshee, tearing at the roof of the house. Rain lashed down in sheets, blurring the landscape into a swirling gray mass. Lightning illuminated the sky, followed by deafening cracks of thunder that shook the ground. Inside the house, they huddled together, the fire in the hearth struggling against the drafts. Clementine watched Jebediah, his face etched with worry. He was a man of the land, weathered and strong, but even he looked shaken by the storm's fury. "It'll pass," she said, her voice a small island of calm in the storm's roar. He nodded, but his eyes betrayed his fear. He had seen storms like this before, storms that could wipe out a year's worth of work in a single night. Suddenly, a deafening crack echoed through the house. They both jumped, their hearts pounding in their chests. Jebediah grabbed his rifle, his eyes scanning the darkness. "What was that?" Clementine whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," he said, his voice grim. "But I'm going to find out." He opened the door, bracing himself against the wind and rain. Clementine grabbed his arm. "Be careful," she pleaded. He squeezed her hand, a silent promise, then stepped out into the storm. The wind nearly ripped the door from his grasp as he fought his way towards the barn. Lightning flashed, revealing a scene of devastation. The roof of the barn was partially torn away, exposing the haystacks within to the elements. One of the support beams had snapped, likely the source of the earlier crack. He knew, with a sinking feeling, that if he didn't act quickly, the entire barn could collapse. And if the barn went, they would lose everything. The livestock, the winter stores, their livelihood. He had to do something. Anything. He raced back to the house, his body battered by the wind and rain. He burst through the door soaked to the bone. "The barn," he gasped. "It's going to collapse." Clementine didn't hesitate. She grabbed her shawl and followed him back out into the storm. "What can we do?" she asked, her voice unwavering. "We need to brace the beam," he said, his mind vague. "But we need something strong, something sturdy." He remembered the old wagon wheel, the one he had been meaning to repair for months. It was strong, soft, solid oak. It might just be enough. Together, they fought their way to the wagon, the wind howling in their ears. They wrestled the heavy wheel free, their muscles straining with the effort. Then, inch by agonizing inch, they dragged it towards the barn, the mud sucking at their boots. Inside the barn they worked feverishly, wedging the wheel against the broken beam. The wind howled. The rain poured down, but they persevered, driven by a shared determination. Finally, with a grunt of effort, they secured the wheel in place. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. For now. They stumbled back to the house, exhausted and soaked, but alive. As they huddled together by the fire, the storm still raging outside, they knew they had faced the worst, and they had survived. The storm had tested them, pushed them to their limits, but it had also forged a bond between them, a bond as strong and enduring as the land itself. And as the first rays of dawn broke through the storm clouds, they knew, with a certainty that settled deep in their hearts, that they could face anything, as long as they faced it together. The aftermath of the storm was a tableau of wreckage painted against a bruised dawn. The landscape, once familiar, now looked ravaged, stripped bare by the wind's fury. But amidst the devastation, a quiet resilience began to bloom. Jebediah stood beside Clementine, surveying the damage, a shared understanding passing between them. It wouldn't be easy, but they would rebuild. The days that followed were a blur of hard labor. They salvaged what they could, mending fences, clearing debris, and tending to the injured livestock. Jebediah, his initial gruffness softened by the shared ordeal, found himself relying on Clementine more and more. Her knowledge of herbs proved invaluable in treating the animals. Her ingenuity in repurposing salvaged materials was nothing short of remarkable. He watched her, truly saw her, and the respect he felt deepened with each passing day. He remembered his initial resentment, his misguided belief that she was somehow lacking. He'd been so focused on his own needs, his own burdens, that he'd failed to see the strength that resided within her. Now he saw it clearly, etched in the lines of her face, in the calluses on her hands, in the unwavering determination in her eyes. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold, they sat together on the porch, their bodies aching, their spirits weary but unbroken. The rebuilt barn stood silhouetted against the twilight, a testament to their shared effort. "Thank you, Clementine," Jebediah said, his voice rough with emotion. "For everything. I don't know what I would have done without you." Clementine smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that reached her eyes. "We did it together, Jebediah," she said softly. "That's what matters." He reached out, taking her hand in his. Her skin was rough, calloused from the work, but her grip was firm, steady. He looked into her eyes, saw not a mail-order bride, not a solution to his problems, but a partner, a friend, a woman he was beginning to love. The following weeks brought a sense of normalcy back to the ranch. The fields were replanted, the livestock recovered, and the house, though still bearing the scars of the storm, felt like a home. Jebediah and Clementine settled into a comfortable rhythm, their days filled with shared labor, their evenings with quiet companionship. They spoke little, but their silences were filled with understanding, with a growing affection that needed no words. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Clementine picked up her banjo, its strings worn but familiar. She began to play a soft, melancholic tune, a song her mother used to sing. Jebediah listened, his heart filled with a warmth he hadn't felt in years. As the music filled the small house, he realized that he had been given a second chance, a chance to rebuild not only his ranch, but also his life. He had found a woman of strength, intelligence, and undeferring love, a woman who had weathered the storm by his side. And as he looked at Clementine's mind, her face illuminated by the firelight, he knew that he was finally home. The West was still wild, unforgiving, but with Clementine by his side, he was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The embers in the hearth glowed low, casting dancing shadows across the walls of the small ranch house. Jebediah leaned back in his chair, the familiar creak a comforting sound. Clementine's banjo lay silent beside her, her hands clasped in her lap. The firelight painted her face in warm hues, highlighting the lines etched by sun and wind, lines that now seemed to tell a story of strength and resilience. He watched her, a quiet contentment settling over him. The storm had passed. The ranch was rebuilt. And something within him, something long dormant, had also been resurrected. He had come to the West seeking a solution, a way to ease his loneliness, to secure his future. He'd found something far greater, something he hadn't even known he was missing. Clementine stirred, her gaze meeting his. There was a question in her eyes, a gentle inquiry. He didn't need words to understand. She was asking if he was all right, if the peace he seemed to have found was genuine. He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. "I was just thinking," he said, his voice rough but sincere, "about how wrong I was." She squeezed his hand, a silent encouragement. "I came here thinking I needed a wife," he continued, his gaze fixed on their intertwined hands. "Someone to cook and clean, to help me run the ranch. I saw you as a solution to a problem." He paused, a flicker of shame crossing his face. "I didn't see you, Clementine." "Not really. I didn't see your strength, your intelligence, your heart." Clementine smiled, a soft, forgiving smile. "We all make mistakes, Jebediah," she said gently. "What matters is that we learn from them." "I have learned," he said, his voice firm. "I've learned that true wealth isn't measured in land or livestock, but in the bonds we share, in the love and respect we give to one another." He looked up, his eyes meeting hers. "I've learned that I am a very lucky man." He stood, pulling her up with him. He led her to the porch, where the last rays of the setting sun painted the sky in breathtaking hues of gold, crimson, and violet. The air was still, carrying the scent of sagebrush and damp earth. They stood side by side, their shoulders touching, their silhouettes outlined against the fiery sky. The rebuilt barn stood proudly in the distance, a symbol of their shared labor, their shared resilience. "It's beautiful," Clementine whispered, her voice filled with awe. Yes, Jebediah said, his gaze fixed on her. It is. He wasn't just talking about the sunsets, he said. He was talking about the life they had built together, the love they had found in the most unexpected of places, Hastings. He had judged her, a mail-order bride, by the cover. He had failed to see the treasure within. He put his arm around her, pulling her close. The West was still wild, still unforgiving. But with Clementine by his side, he knew he could face anything. He had found a love forged in hardship, a love that was stronger than any storm, a love that was his true wealth. And as they stood there, watching the sun sink below the horizon, he knew that he was finally, truly home.